Hello, welcome to the Retro Game Club Podcast, Season 7, Episode 5, which is also Episode 194. I am Rob, and joining me is an entrepreneur, a game reviewer, an author, journalist, producer, musician, podcaster, worked on Lonely Girl 15, which at one point was the most watched thing on YouTube, which probably means the internet, founding editor at GameSpot, worked or contributed to MSNBC's The Site, GeForce XPlay, Icons, Tech TV, CNET, Game Center, and Blaster Magazine, and also hosts Wrestling Inc. podcast and is co-host of Game Boys to Men. Joining me is Glenn Rubenstein. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, good to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Was any of that false information, or was all that correct?
Wrestling Inc. canceled us like 2 months ago.
Oh,
so I'm
no.
doing all my wrestling stuff on Gigantic Pop. You know, there was an 8-year run though, man.
Yeah.
It was kind of crazy, and I just sort of fell into that accidentally, posting that. So it's kind of weird because I spent 8 years of my life where I was like, oh, gotta watch Raw, gotta watch SmackDown, gotta watch NXT, and then talk about it immediately after. And then I took a little break. About 6 weeks ago, we did Gigantic Pop for the Royal Rumble the other night, and I was just like, man, am I out of step? You know, it's like the second I stopped watching, it's like didn't even think about wrestling for 6 weeks, which is kind of crazy.
Well, there are a lot of wrestling fans that listen to this this podcast. So do you have any other wrestling things happening right now?
Yeah,
no?
Gigantic Pop is the channel on YouTube, and that's me, Raj Giri, the former owner of Wrestling Inc., and the Blueprint Matt Morgan, who was in WWE and TNA. Contested on season 2 of Tough Enough, and he was an American Gladiator in the 2008 revival as well. So nice. Matt and I could not be more different, but it is very funny. We're the same age though, so when we talk wrestling, and I can usually pop him with video game and pop culture references he hasn't thought about in 40 years. You know,
that's awesome. Yeah, very, very fun. Very fun resume you have. And yeah, it kind of feels like, if I focused not on music and more on the game stuff, like we talked about how we were probably ships passing the night on many of this stuff, at least the music stuff.
It's crazy how it all overlaps though, right? It's like, I think gaming is, especially for people of our generation, where I think we grew up with it and it was a bit of the escape. It was still at a time when it was social, but it wasn't socially cool necessarily. All the time. It does hold a certain fondness, and I think is ingrained in our upbringing and DNA in a way that later generations will never understand.
Yeah, because it was always ubiquitous and accepted, and with the later generation. Yeah. For our listeners that might not know, you started video game journalism really young, right?
14, yeah.
And that was for the San Francisco Examiner, is that correct?
Actually, originally it was for a small paper where Jeff Gerstmann and I grew up about 40 minutes north of San Francisco. And I was trying to explain this the other day. I have someone that I work with, and we were talking about characters we admire, and I just sort of blurted out of nowhere. I was like, oh, I really admire your audacity. And I was like, oh, is that a compliment? I'm like, yes, yes, it is a compliment, because at the age of 14, I wrote my local newspaper a letter on a typewriter and said, you should have me write a column about video games. Here's a writing sample. And they said, yes. And I said, just having the ability to do that and put yourself out there and pitch yourself, it goes beyond ambition. The ability to hype yourself up and make a case so well that the other person goes, yeah, that is a good idea. That's a special gift. And I think it's something I've never tried to lose sight of. It's a little bit of, fake it till you make it. But I'll tell you, I mean, I did that at 14, and I just kept trying to level up from there. I did the same thing 3 months after I was doing that small paper with the circulation of like 5,000 readers, then sending a fax to the San Francisco Examiner and like, we should talk to a reporter there. Like, you cover the video game business, I cover the video game business. Let's have lunch.
And that was definitely a product of the time too. I mean, other than obviously hard work and motivation is forever, but back then, I'm really going to try not to keep bringing this back to music, but it'll be hard. But, back then I was working in a guitar store and had access to all this beta stuff that people would bring in. And so I was able to, have a digital 4-track at home right into my computer and have a CDR. So in the early 90s, being able to give CDs to places, or if they say, just give us your demo, something that brings you a bit higher than everyone else. and sets you apart, but you have that motivation where you're just going to do it. And at the same time, trying to sell PlayStations out of the back of the guitar store because I figured out through the internet how to become a wholesaler. And, my point is back then there weren't as many people that just figured out that there's no secret sauce. There's no someone in a lab coat that knows more than you. If you just do it and like you said, fake it till you make it, they'll accept you. And there you go. You start your career. But you, you were, what was it? The Vid Kid, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, the Vid Kid, Leo Laporte called me that, the Game Boy. So I met Leo. This was long before Twit, long before Tech TV. He was like doing fill and DJ shifts on KMBR and stations in San Francisco. And so my mom, who was my de facto publicist, she would listen to the radio all day at her job in marketing. And she said, they have people on all the time to talk about gardening or, home theater or just random hobbies. Like, why don't we send some fax? My mom was a master of the fax machine. Why don't we send some faxes to the local radio station, say they should have you on as a guest to talk about hot games for Christmas? And I was doing that with the regular DJ, Peter B. Collins, on KMBR. And one day Peter was out and I was told, oh, Leo Laporte's filling in for him today. Oh, you're going to love Leo. He's a computer guy. He does some computer coverage as well. And then, got to know Leo. He was then doing what was at the time Dvorak on computers. Shortly thereafter, which was a nationally syndicated radio show. Then
okay, I'd never heard of that one. I was going to ask.
Yeah, it became On Computers with Leo, and then he had Gina Smith as a co-host back when Gina was doing multimedia tech writing in the Bay Area. And they brought me in originally to like monitor the chat room, but then also do video game reviews. It was like, they were like, well, to pay you, we have to have you do something else.
Seems like a dream job.
Yeah, well, it was great. And then Leo, because we lived in the same town, he lived in the same town as me and Jeff. Leo would pick me up on like Sunday morning at 8 a.m. and we would drive to the city for our 10 a.m. on air time. And in those car rides, it was interesting to get feedback from, at the time, he was a radio pro who'd been doing it, 15, 20 years. And to have him being like, oh, you need a gimmick, you need some bits, you need some things you could do here or there. Like, that was really, really valuable mentorship. And at the same time, he'd freelanced for people, for magazines, going back to like Computer Gaming World and things like that, and PC World. And so we were talking about that. I don't know if it came through him. He might have got me into Wired before it was launching, and I was like the video game guy. It's funny, I talked about this on the podcast with Jeff Gerstmann on his Patreon, Game Boys to Men. I contributed to the first 3 issues of Wired, and then I kind of blew it off.
That's right. Yeah. Why did you blow it off again?
Because I was 17 and I was an idiot. It's like, oh, your friends want to go out and drink and, go to the coffee shop and hang out till 3 a.m, eating fries with ranch dressing and drinking coffee and, figuring out how to get someone to buy you alcohol or porn. Like, I had bigger and better things to do to contribute to Wired magazine. I mean, come on. So a lot of it was and this has been a recurring theme of what Jeff and I talk about a lot. Like, a lot of opportunity was, we took part in a lot of opportunities, and we both had very, very incredible careers, but a lot of opportunity was lost on us, either due to distraction or not having the next piece of ambition to unlock things. Jeff and I both got hired. I got hired first as the founding editor on the console section of GameSpot. And then I brought Jeff in along with a friend of ours, Ryan McDonald, who was also a teenage video game journalist. But, Jeff and I talked about this one episode. It was just like, this was in 1996. Like, we were early users of the web. We'd done Blaster. It was, we did Blaster in 94. I was like, why in 1995 do we not have our act together enough or some connections that we should have gone out there and been getting funding to do a video game website? Why were we hired to work for somebody else and we got zero equity in that endeavor? So I think looking back on it, it's like, man, if I just would have had, again, I had that audacity, I had that ambition, but man, if I just would have had one more piece of it, I think our lives could have turned out much, much differently, because we could have risen to the occasion to capitalize on that moment that will never be here again.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned Jeff's podcast. So yeah, Jeff Gerstmann has his own podcast, The Jeff Gerstmann Show, and then you are part of the Patreon Game Boys to Men, which is my favorite podcast. And I think it captures, how can I word this? So I email a lot of podcasts retro, not even retro, video game journalists.
Yeah.
And none of them answer the question of like, what's the day in the life of a video game journalist, or, what's it like actually being in the business for people on the outside? And,
Yeah.
and I feel like you guys not only capture that now, but you do it from like 94 until now. And it's just a blast to listen to. And it gives like great perspectives, fun stories. And, you guys dive into other topics too, but it's from the time. And I'm hoping this episode is a gateway drug for a lot of our listeners, because I do think it's worth the price of admission for sure.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think it started as this will be a fun walk down memory lane to talk about some of the cooler and crazier things we did as kids. And then as we went on, and Jeff and I talk about this in an episode, it kind of became this weird version of therapy. As you're getting into, beyond just the high points of this, it's like, oh, what was I going through at this point? What was happening in my life? What are my regrets? Et cetera, et cetera. And it's definitely the most personal thing I think I've ever been involved in. And I think part of the challenges with the release schedule is that, it's cathartic and it's fun, but I think it is also emotional in a way that is not like, oh, I can't wait to get in and revisit.
Well, yeah, because you guys not only talk about what was happening in video games at the time, but you talk about what was happening in your lives at the time as you're growing up and dealing with this or that, or everything. Not everything teenagers do, but pretty deep stuff.
Yeah, you know what it is, Rob? It's that I have this inability to stay on topic, and it could have been a very clean, hey, remember what happened at this time? And actually, I have this funny story about this and that. But no, instead it became like, and then I made a terrible decision to dye my hair black and shave lines in my eyebrow, and I spent the next 6 months wondering why girls didn't like me. It's it just brings up so much stuff to go back to that time, but it's been very rewarding, and I think we are gonna see through the journey, and once that's all done, who knows what form the project could take on after that.
I mean, like you said, you were talking about how I forget where we started this actual recording, but you were talking about how ideas about guests. I forget if it was for that podcast, but even having we had a perfect guest, because you guys, I don't know about now, but you guys talk about 90s hip hop in the past, having Arabian Prince on there.
Yeah, that's right.
talk about bringing his Amiga to program with while on the Straight Outta Compton tour, like stuff you could bring in people that weren't part of your guys' lives, but in the scene, I guess. But yeah, that's just a thought on the top of my head. But this also serves as, there are many episodes, so I don't want people to think they're hearing all of it in this one interview. This is like 0.001% of what you guys get into. And not only did you have the crazy experience of being a 14-year-old game journalist, but because of that, didn't Nintendo depose you or something like that? Like you were part of the Game Genie trial, right?
I guess there was a deposition. I'm great at two truths and a lie. Because one thing, and I'd forgotten about it, to be honest. I probably didn't talk about it for the better part of 20 years. And now it's become sort of my icebreaker when somebody says, Glenn, what's a fun fact about you? I say, well, as a teenager, I testified against Nintendo in federal court. I was a part of the Game Genie trial. Louis Galoob Toys, San Francisco Bay Area company, had seen my column and said, we got this product, the Game Genie. Nintendo doesn't want it to be sold. We both sued each other. We're trying to fight to get this on the stores. Nintendo's saying it violates their copyrights. And it makes games less fun or breaks games. And you as a gamer, can you give expert witness testimony to talk about how you as a gamer find this actually makes games more fun and enhances them, and how gamers are smart and are going to understand it's a trial and error thing. And if something goes wrong, they're not going to be mad at Nintendo. That was the gist of it. Mm-hmm. And I did it. I got woefully underpaid for the experience because I didn't know what expert witnesses should make. And took that money, bought my first crappy used car. And lo and behold, when the verdict came out, the judge said that my expert testimony was more compelling than anyone Nintendo put up because I was part of the target audience. for Nintendo's products. And so because of that, for the next few years, Louis Galoob Toys would basically pay me to do just about anything. They were very, very thankful.
That's great.
And I found out, like, this isn't to my own horn, but I didn't find out till later where it was like, oh yeah, if they lost that Game Genie trial, like Galoob Toys was going to be done.
Done, yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you pretty much said that it made the games last longer. Like, yeah, you could run through them, and then also you have the NES Advantage and stuff like that that actually breaks games.
Yeah, or I said you could use the Game Genie to make the games harder or more challenging, which I don't think anyone ever actually did.
Yeah.
Statute of limitations is up on that, but yeah, I think that was one of the hypotheticals I floated in testimony to say it's not just like the ultimate cheat code, you know?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Game Genie, yeah, that was proto emulation for me, where the Game Genie had to exist for stuff like retro achievements. You know, if technology was just a bit more further ahead, possibly they could have had like a cartridge that had like retro achievements or something like that. I don't know.
But yeah, it was a cool product though. It was a cool idea. And I think in a way, God, let me put a long tail on this kite here. It's like, in a way, I think that mentality of giving a consumer piece of technology that would allow people to essentially do like poke commands or whatever with a console, like that was kind of groundbreaking, that on the road to hacks, modifications, and emulation.
And because you're a journalist, and before I switch topics, I'm like chasing butterflies with all the fun stories you have. You kept that positive relationship with Nintendo after that, right?
Well, they had to. I mean, I was covering their products for like the most tech savvy, major metropolitan area. So the way the Examiner works, so for people that don't know, there's two papers in San Francisco, the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Examiner. San Francisco Chronicle is actually a much bigger paper on a daily basis. However, on Sunday, San Francisco Chronicle publishes a combo edition with the San Francisco Examiner that was mostly the Examiner content. So the Examiner was kind of the cooler, more affluent paper. So there were probably more video game readers, computer readers, tech readers on that. But what companies really wanted was, oh, please let it be that Glenn's got a feature story or a gift guide or something running in that Sunday paper, because that's going to be read by 3 million people. And remember, there weren't a lot of newspapers that were covering it. And additionally, we talked about this in Game Boys to Men. This is kind of weird to think about in hindsight, because I was a teenage video game reviewer. I think they also saw me as a little more pliable than like the Walt Mossbergs of the world.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, they could give you subtle hints to kind of sway you in a direction, maybe.
Well, they were never going to fly. Walt Mossberg would never have accepted a plane trip to go to Nintendo for like a feel-good trip get excited about Nintendo's new games and listen to the company line. And I think that there was a period of adjustment in really learning what it meant to be a journalist, because again, even though I was quote unquote a journalist when I started, like I knew a little bit and I had an idea of like, oh, this is what the ethics are. This is what the standard should be. I should play the game to completion before I write the review. Like I understood those things. But at the same time, I think it wasn't until later. In fact, part of it was how Jeff Gerstmann and I met, because I'd written a preview from CES of Bill Laimbeer's Combat Basketball along with some other games from CES. And the people making the game were like, oh, it's going to have this and this and this. So when I wrote the preview, I'm like, wow, this sounds really exciting. The game's going to have this and this and this. Game came out and the game sucked. And Jeff Gerstmann, high school student, wanted to give me a piece of his mind and talk to me about why did I hype up this game that actually, the end result sucked. And I was like, well, it was a preview, man. I didn't know what the finished product was going to be.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a learning experience, in figuring that out. So I think, yeah, as a teenage video game journalist, I think they saw, and there were other teen video game journalists, and there were other, how can I put this? There were other, let's call them hobbyist journalists, meaning people that maybe didn't go to journalism school or weren't staff writers from the paper. And I don't want to name names, but there were other people that I would meet at junkets who wrote for decent outlets, magazines or newspapers. But it's like, that was kind of their gig. Like, or maybe they had a day job, but they were, they were writing for the newspaper for free because, Nintendo, Sega, and all these companies were flying them around the country to hype them up on video games. It was a very weird time. In this business where, in fact, I would argue that you couldn't make a living, as a video game journalist. That's why as a teenager, you were subsidized by your parents. That's probably why there were so many of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Well, we'll tell our listeners that you do have a Howard Lincoln story at a baseball game that I will let them listen to Game Boys to Men to hear that one, because that one is a jaw dropper.
I always liked that guy.
Yeah. I mean, you said for a while you had his phone number. You could call him up and for anything.
A lot of them, you know, and it was like, that was also kind of crazy, right? To where it was, you know, anytime there was a school raffle, I needed some prizes. Just call my friends at Sega or Nintendo, you know?
Oh, speaking of which, it's a great segue where I was going to say, like, yeah, you were young and you were, like I talked about before when I was working in a music store, I would get all these beta and advanced products just to test out. You got that on the video game side, right? Like you talk about Jeff, just giving Jeff an Amiga because you had two.
Yeah. It was weird. So beta and advanced stuff was always hard to come by because this was back in the day of EPROMs.
Oh yeah.
You know, so literally, and we would have sometimes where people would be like, yeah, we need those back. That was always the weirdest thing to me because as a teenager, I was like, how am I gonna, so I have to box this up, ship this, go to the post office, mail this back. I remember,
and what are they going to do with it anyway?
No, well, they were going to reuse the EPROMs because erasable, reprogrammable memory.
Yeah.
So I remember, who was it? I remember one time when meeting with the CEO of Tengen, like he just wanted to meet me for like drinks, or like we were in a lobby and I got my Diet Coke and he had whatever, but he gave me like some long strips of EPROMs. It was like essentially, and I was expected to take those, plug those into my own cartridge, which they assumed I had. And I remember, I think Jeff helped me with that. It was like, he gave me like 5 strips of upcoming Tengen games. And I think it took 2 of them where we accidentally bent the prongs trying to get it in before we finally got one right. You know?
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, I'm not this technical. It's like, why don't you just ask me to solder something? Yeah, it was so weird. So beta games were harder to come by. Because that was my interest before I got into it. Before I got into writing about games, like Japanese imports were a big thing. Remember EGM like would hype the hell out of import games a lot of the time. So in San Francisco, Japantown had like 2 stores that would sell imports, and it was kind of insane. I remember paying like $100 for like Phantasy Star 3 in Japanese, which I don't know why. And I remember just sort of guessing my way through it. But so imports were really big. So when I got in the business, I was like, oh, now I'm going to get all these imports and beta releases. And I was like, well, no, not really. You're going to get a lot of shrink wrap finished games.
Did you get any like PC parts, like video or audio cards or anything like that?
Yeah, I got, I remember getting like a Turtle Beach sound card early on. I can't remember the name of the company, but I remember getting a CD-ROM standalone thing. It was cool. Like literally it was a CD-ROM drive that sat on top of your computer. It had speakers built into it. And I remember I had to install a SCSI card, and that was the first time I ever opened my PC.
I remember those. Yeah, I remember that I could picture that whole setup.
Yeah, and I remember that I was like, ooh, now I can play a CD game. And then I remember the big thing where it was like, oh, no, this game requires a 2x CD. I only have a 1x CD read speed. But I remember getting a lot of that, or getting like weird. I remember one day, Jeff Gerstmann and I went through like, those big PC magazines, the one that was the size of phone books. And we were like, what, it was like, Glenn, what product should you, I'm making air quotes, what product should you write about next? Like, what do we want? What do we want for free?
Yeah.
And just getting like weird stuff sent to us, like a Bernoulli drive, which is like a precursor to the zip disk. It had like huge, and I think it held like, 20 megabytes on this huge cartridge. So yeah, we would figure out that, or like just what did we want to get, and then I would just write these roundups for the examiner, where it would be like, oh hey, use this if you want to expand your memory, use this if you need more removable storage. It was quite a good racket for quite some time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What about getting back to Nintendo? And also for my personal, I know the listeners will love this, but I just want to hear more about it because I feel like on your podcast, I don't know if I just got distracted or something, but I was like, I need more details about this. The Nintendo train.
Oh God, the train trip.
So was it what was that for? How old were you when you went alone on a train across America?
I was 17 years old and I'd just been grounded. Like my mom had actually said I was on like probation.
Do you remember what you did?
I don't remember. I was probably like long distance phone calls to where's
Okay.
BBS's trying to get games.
Yeah. Been
You know,
there.
a variety of things that teenagers would do to get in trouble where you get your modem taken away from you.
Mhm.
And this was 93. So this was right before like slip access or PPP access for early days of the World Wide Web. Yeah, it was like right before that. So I was still calling where's BBS's. And anyhow, so Nintendo for Legend of Zelda Link to the Past, that was the one on the Game Boy. They had this idea, like video game junkets were just like leveling up a little bit. It before it'd been like, oh, come down and we're gonna, here's someone in a Sonic costume. Sega had said, for Tomcat Alley, we're gonna fly journalists up in F-14s and have them play Tomcat Alley and take them to like a retired decommissioned Air Force
As
base
you do,
for the weekend. Yeah. And Nintendo was like, we need to counter program that. I know, we'll put a bunch of journalists on a train. And by the way, Sega was the hip company. I think everyone knows that. So Nintendo's answer was always kind of a little bit lamer, like a lamer version of like what Sega wanted to do, or just the not cool version, because I'm sure someone in Nintendo was like, oh my God, the liability. We can't put people up in F-14. So how do we even ensure that?
Yeah.
But so they said, we're going to put a bunch of journalists on a train, and you're going to play the new Game Boy game, and then we'll have winners. Whoever beats it first, Nintendo will donate like some money to a charity of their choice. And so what happened were there were floods that summer. So like there were floods like right before this trip was supposed to happen. So what was originally supposed to be New York to LA on like first class accommodations with sleeper cars via Amtrak, because the flooding became New York to Seattle to visit Nintendo's headquarters, on Gen Pop on the train, where I think they had access to like 2 sleeper cars that you could go in and shower and use the restroom. But the rest of the time you were just sitting in coach, just to like, we commissioned, we took over half a part of a train car. And yeah, it sucked. It was maybe 20 of us. I think I know Andy Eddy was there. Russ Sokola was there. Andy McNamara from Game Informer at the time, but I think he was just coming out of the Andy the Video Dandy.
And didn't you say a lot of people bounced like midway through? They were like, we're done.
Oh yeah, what's his face? That later wrote the Motley Crue book. Why am I and the pickup artist guy, like the guy that reinvented himself. Why can't I remember his name?
Because we're old. That's why.
Yeah. Now I need to look this up. So yeah, he was the writer for Entertainment Weekly at the time, and he was not a gamer. The word was that he didn't play the games. He just had like videotapes sent to him, and then he would write these previews for Entertainment Weekly. So the train got to Chicago. Oh, Neil Strauss, that's what I'm thinking of.
Oh yeah.
And it was like he just got out of there. He was like, I'm not doing this, and left the train trip. I think some people actually used like the phrase, these accommodations are unacceptable.
He was probably not wrong.
Yeah. So the rest of us hung with it though and stayed with it, and it was like 3 or 4 days. I think we stopped showering at one point because we were like, it was so uncomfortable and just didn't make sense. And I think a lot of us just gave up playing the game, and we were just hanging out, having discussions about the most random things. It was such a weird experience in my life. And I think part of what I loved about it is the sort of thing as an adult, you would never, like now in the year 2025, like you would never do something like this. But there was this ragtag group with a bunch of us, some younger, some older, just hanging out and making the best of a terrible situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of us didn't even know that was a thing that happened. You know what I mean? Because it's not like Nintendo World Championship where they're promoting this thing everywhere.
No. And junket you wouldn't have known, right? So it's like, in fact, I think the World of the Press junket is it's still one of the most like secretive things in media. I mean, for instance, I live in Las Vegas now. WrestleMania is coming up here in April, and I wasn't invited to it, which, little bit hurt my feelings as someone who did a wrestling podcast for 8 years.
Yeah.
But like WWE just had a bunch of wrestling journalists in Vegas for like this whirlwind 3 days of like, now you're going to go play Topgolf. Now you're going to go to a show, Resorts World. It was like these things happen, but journalists don't talk about them because it doesn't make them look good.
Mm-hmm.
Be like, hey, I just accepted this trip, on another company's dime. Companies don't talk about it because it's just going to like, the fans aren't going to know what to make of that information.
Yeah.
Just the fact that video game junkets existed for so long, like, and they still do. I mean, in fact, 2K Games does video game junkets around these WWE weekends or Mania or Royal Rumble or stuff like that. Like, yeah, it's still like the weirdest unspoken aspect of all journalism. Like junkets absolutely still happen. So these video game ones were pretty nuts for a while. Like we remember 3DO, I think it was, had like a murder mystery dinner thing at the Winchester Mystery House. Nintendo had some weird one where we had to go to this weird medieval dinner that was not medieval times. We went to like some dude's house in the woods.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in your podcast, you guys talk about a lot of weird parties you've been to, possibly almost kicked out of a few of them, and not wanting to be at least Jeff not wanting to be at most of them, just standing in the corner.
Yeah, whereas for me, like, if you invite me to something, I will normally show up way too early and I will shut it down. Like, unless it's really, really awful, I will usually just because I'm like, I don't want to leave because something cool might happen, because you never know, and you never know what they have in store. And it's also, I think, I always valued that this was my chance to have FaceTime with people that I only got to see at these things, whether it was people at the companies or other journalists that I was friends with. Like, it was like, oh yeah, I want to make the most of seeing these people. It's like, give an example, it's like, I love Dan Amrich. I don't think I've ever hung out with Dan Amrich if we weren't at a junket or it wasn't on somebody else's dime. Like,
yeah, it's an excuse to see friends and people you like.
Yeah, and another company's paying for it.
So exactly, yeah. What I always picture, though, with that stuff, because I've never been on a junket, is, what was the name of, was it GameWorks? Was that Spielberg's Dave and Buster? Yeah. Do you remember the launch MTV thing they did for that? Everyone is inebriated and they have no idea what's going on, but they're just having fun hanging out, and they're just there because they're paid or whatever, for whatever reason. Yeah.
That was Wing Commander 3. That party was incredible because Mark Hamill was there, Malcolm McDowell was there, Tom Wilson from Back to the Future was there, and a bunch of journalists just like, about like, I'm going to go up to Mark Hamill and just the dumbest shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, because everybody has a different attitude towards how they're going to talk to people. But it was like that chance. It was like, if I ever just want to say something stupid to Malcolm McDowell, he's right here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like access, you would never get this kind of access even at a convention. You would get dragged away by security, for some of the stuff you could have gotten away with at these junkets. I remember Stan Lee was at one for Sega. And he just clearly like didn't want to be there and didn't care, and everything was, oh yeah. It was like the first half of that conversation of Mallrats. It was like, yeah, I did that thing. That's correct. It's like, like some of these were just so weird. This is why I've said this. I don't know that Jeff shares this ambition, and I think we're probably 3 years too late, 5 years too late for the boom. But I'm like, man, if we'd had this idea for Game Boys to Men 10 years ago, this could have made an amazing fictionalized streaming series. Like, because there's so much comedic potential for the dumb situations and crazy things that we were around and did.
I think you guys have mentioned that on the podcast, and I think this would make a great like Netflix series. I really do. Yeah. I mean, they bought the rights to what was that? What was that book? Console Wars.
Yeah.
They were supposed to kind of sensationalize that, almost like they did with Tetris, which I thought was was my movie of the year. That there was no reason that movie should be good. I had a blast watching it.
It was great, but it was it
was stupid. But I loved it.
They really massaged and fictionalized it. I mean, it was not a Tom Clancy like operation the way they made it out to be. But
I loved it.
I think that's the thing. I think the reality is the reality is surprising and very entertaining, but man, you could just take a little bit of hyperbole there and have an absolutely incredible series.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a coming of age series too, because you're so young in it. Yeah. So so I don't want to take too much of your time. So I figure, listeners, that is a very, very small part of Game Boys to Men. I'll put in the link in the show notes to Jeff Gerstmann's Patreon, which is weird. You're going to someone else's Patreon to hear Glenn's podcast. But I figure you have a lot of stories about a lot of our other news topics and stuff like that. So please feel to pepper stuff in. And before we get to that stuff, is there anything I could have you plug? Anything you're working on now, where to find you, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on X. God, I can't believe I actually just said that as opposed to Twitter. But you can find me on X at Glenn Rubenstein. And I'm doing Gigantic Pop, doing wrestling coverage on there. My podcast, speaking of the 90s, the podcast I do recapping Yellow Jackets is coming back with season 3 in mid-February. So that'll be fun. And I'm sure there'll be more stuff.
Great. I can't wait to hear it all. And so, you're hanging out for the rest of the podcast, and I think it'll be a short one. So next up is our news, and only a few articles I chose this week. So the first one is a launch of a PS2 Memory Card Pro, which is a new-ish memory card you could put in your PS2, which came out a while ago, but this next version and its firmware, you can actually just load up the SD card with ISOs and launch your PS2 games right from there. So no need to hack a PS2 or anything anymore.
Nice.
So back in the day, like I had a Z64 Mr. Backup, and what was the one for Super Nintendo? I always forget the name of that one. I forget if I owned it or if I borrowed it, but did you have any of those early iterations of anything like that?
I'm trying to think. I remember what was it with the N64 and zip disks? I think I remember
that was the Z64.
Yeah, I remember that. And then strong recollections of taking the lid off my Sega Genesis to fit import games in there, or modding the PS1, PS2. And man, if I never have to solder anything ever again, I'll be so happy.
Nice. Yeah. I'm so happy that stuff like this is coming out, because again, we're not talking about pirating. Like if these games aren't available to buy, like just play them the only way you can.
Yeah, I hooked up my Xbox 360 before the marketplace shut down, and I was playing a little Jaws Unleashed.
Nice.
I'm just like, why hasn't that gotten a remaster or a re-release on next gen systems? But yeah, it's kind of crazy, like the stuff that you would have thought once we moved to disc-based gaming that everything from that point would at least be playable on subsequent iterations of the same system families.
Yeah. Xbox almost did it right, but they just didn't keep it going. Let's see. The next article, Crazy Taxi prototype shows Sega was experimenting with GTA-style camera angles. So these camera angles are like the GTA 2 type camera angles. And in this video, like, they made the right choice and didn't use this. But it's still cool to see these prototypes. And I don't know if you were there for the Dreamcast launch.
Yeah, I was. I think by that time, I guess I was right before we could see that Game Center, so I was still at the Examiner. But it's kind of amazing in the mining of intellectual property and celebration of gaming's past, and want to like stomp out emulation and the need for it and whatnot. Like, I'm amazed that companies haven't realized they can put in just a modicum of resources and money to release a lot of beta software or things that just were never fully finished, and at least recoup some of their investments.
Oh, totally. And also speaking about, emulation from earlier systems, with Xbox Series X and even the Xbox One, when they did the backwards compatibility only on certain titles, like, why not just have a fallback emulator that it goes to? It knows what disc it is and If it works, it works. If not, everyone knows it's like a beta thing. Like, deal with it. Maybe we'll update it. We don't know. That would make so many people happy.
It's so crazy to me. But then you hear on the other end of the spectrum, then you hear about like, oh, fans found, a long lost alpha generation version of this game and then put in hundreds of hours of work to make it playable or release it. And it's just like, man, while people are still alive and some of the people that worked on it are still accessible, like, I don't know why there's not more of an effort to have an official archive of these things.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I think the Video Game History Foundation is trying to, but and now Sony has was it last year or 2 years ago, they hired someone who's in charge of archiving and history stuff. So hopefully hopefully it gets better. But you did remind me of something that I've brought up on this podcast a few times. I'd love your take on this. So you mentioned while these people are still alive, while they're still doing it, like, why not have them work on it a little bit? What about the journalistic part where people like us, we were there, we remember what it felt like when all these systems were released. And you can even say the same thing about music too. You have these new journalists, one that me and the co-host Hugh that just retired would bring up a lot is, a few years ago, people talking about, I just, found out that you can continue in Super Mario Brothers. It's like every one of us knew that back in the day. And, there's 100 things like that. So people like us will eventually start retiring and not talking about this stuff in public anymore. So how does the next generation, because there's a lot of them even starting now, deal with retro video game journalism? Like what do you think it'll be like, or any advice for these up and coming?
I mean, it's interesting though, right? Because on one hand, for people of a certain age, you want voices that are credible and that speak to the experience that someone that was there would have at that same age. But I would almost argue though that there is something important about having future generations discover and iterate and reinterpret some of this for modern audiences. And I think about this a lot. I'm a huge fan of Back to the Future, and I sigh and shrug and groan following like the Back to the Future subreddit sometimes, because you'll have new fans. I think there was a post today and it was like, did you know that Huey Lewis, who wrote The Power of Love, plays one of the judges in the band audition scene?
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah, bro, at 10 years old, I thought that was like an amazing wink and a nod. And I thought like it was a genius figuring out the Lone Pine Mall thing at the end. But still, you have younger people that see the movie now and they're like, oh my God, did you know this? My mind is blown. So I think you have to allow people to have their own experience and their own prism with which to interpret it. And I think to that end, it also makes it relevant, right? I give an example of there's a sitcom, an old TV show that as a kid, I would have flipped the channel the second it came on. I had no interest in it. I don't care what somebody told me about it, which was Car 54, Where Are You?
I actually liked that show.
well, so now I'm huge on VHS rips and finding like old evenings of programming. And, there are sites that have all of this. And so there was like a Nick at Night recording from, like 1990. And almost 4 episodes of Car 54, Where Are You? And I was like, well, we'll put it on. In worst case scenario, we can watch the commercials and skip the show. And I was like, oh my God, this show is hilarious. Like not only the acting, but the writing, the way the jokes are set up, the plots, it's so clever. It kind of is a proto Seinfeld in the way that it can make multiple plot lines all come together and pay off in this really interesting way. And I'll tell you that, as a kid, if, my father had wanted to espouse, oh, how great Car 54, Where Are You is, I would be like, oh, shut up, old man. I don't care what you're into. I want to watch The Simpsons. It's like me discovering that for myself and having that appreciation and then going back and hearing the stories and reading about it. Like, I think we need to allow younger generations to have their own sense of discovery because they're not going to listen to us anyhow about this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, it was kind of like, my dad trying to get me to listen to Cooper. And it took me till I was in college to realize how fun it was. you know?
Yeah, you kind of have to have your own journey with things. So I think with gaming, it's going to be really interesting to see that. And I think we've kind of seen that a little already, right? It's like, who would have thought that like Super Mario speed runs or some of the way that younger audiences interpret these older games, like, you know, and think about it. It's like, why would you want to take away, you know, the experience of somebody having that sense of discovery with gaming, because that was so much of what made that cool back then.
Yeah.
Was really, you know, and sometimes it was just, we needed hints. Like nobody found warps, the negative warp zones on their own, you know, or the ability to wall walk in Metroid. But if somebody was like, oh, hey, do you know you can do this move and then you figure it out on your own? Like, it felt amazing.
Well, yeah. And part of the context that is lost is we all, or our friend had Nintendo Power or the official Nintendo guidebook to help us. And so when a lot of these kids think, God, this game is so hard, it's like, well, we did have help, you know, or we had the manual there, which sometimes took you halfway there, you know?
Yeah, and we had the Nintendo hotline.
That's right. That's
1-800-422-2602.
Yeah.
You know, back when it was an 800 number.
Still free. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me go off on that tangent, and that's a very good perspective. One last news item that you may have some good perspective on, because you already brought up the 3DO. A fan-made 3DO port of Mortal Kombat 2 is now available, and I don't know if you got to watch some of this video of it, but it looks very close to the arcade. It looks pretty incredible.
Really?
Yeah, they, I don't know where they got all these assets from, but for the 3DO, it looks and sounds great.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, 3DO is capable of quite a lot. I mean, Samurai Showdown, I think the Crystal Dynamics port, like, really was impressive for a machine that people thought was just like a glorified, you know, like hyperstack style games or terrible, like, pixelated games on rails. Like, that machine was capable of a lot more. That controller, though, on the other hand, at least the original one, was not well suited for hardcore gaming.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the few that liked how it was daisy chained, because I was like, well, the person's gonna be sitting next to me anyway. Cool. Yeah.
Sure. But you know what I mean? Like the bulk of it and the heft, like that did not feel very good in the hands.
Yeah, definitely. That was not tested enough with someone playing it long enough. Yeah.
Yeah, 3DO is such a weird system in that the hype for that in the video game industry, I think that was probably the most hyped system ever at the time when it came out. And it's amazing how quickly there was a backlash to this idea of the everything box in multimedia gaming.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, multimedia hype aside, I remember, you know, people I would talk, God, how old would I have been? I was probably, that was what, 94, right?
Yeah.
When that came out. So I would have been a junior in high school. I remember when I was working at Detroit Bagel Factory, us talking about it there or with my other gaming friends, like, so they're licensing this out to other companies. Like, how is this a business model? Was that like in journalism at that time? Were people telling 3DO, like, how is this going to work financially?
This is when I learned that the conventional wisdom is often wrong. And that the journalists, like, everyone can get behind this idea, right? And I had a lot of smart people from, you know, tech pundits and reporters to heads of, you know, billion-dollar companies, because I got to interview all of them, right? And there was this prevailing notion that there will be the black box in your home entertainment center. And with that, you will be able to look at encyclopedias, research travel.
It's the interactive TV.
Yeah, play video games and surf the web. You know, and do home shopping. And 3DO brought about this idea with Trip Hawkins' gaming resume. See, CDI had the home consumer technology angle. Where it's like, well, it's Philips, and they're going to have these partnerships, and they could do this, but they couldn't get the games, right? They couldn't get the games at mass. Gaming was seen as the back door, right? Like the loss leader, like the thing that got everybody in. But if you could control that black box and get everyone in to buy it with the games and get the kind of footprint Nintendo had, then you're going to own home shopping, the internet, like you're going to own everything. You're going to own what would become DVD. The idea was if you could own that black box. And so with 3DO, it was seen, if Tripp hadn't had the Electronic Arts background and the gaming connections, it would have been DOA, right? But he tried doing it that way because Philips and electronics manufacturers lost so much money manufacturing hardware. The idea that 3DO could essentially pass that on to other companies, like Panasonic, and get a license fee on every game sold for owning the platform. Like, it was a decent idea, but it was very much in the zeitgeist at that time, this black box idea, multimedia, VHS was long in the tooth. We thought there was a time, Philips thought VCD was going to be the thing. I've still got a box here somewhere with about 30 video CDs of like Top Gun and Decent Proposal and other Paramount pictures that Philips released on, 2-disc collections. So I think 3DO just really captured the moment, but then helped elevate it to a point that there was almost no way anyone could have followed through on that in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And they got it wrong because it turned out that's, interactive movies. Turns out that's not what people wanted to play.
Yep. Netflix tried it again too.
Yeah, I mean, I like stuff like that because I think it's kind of silly and fun, and I was always a fan of choose your own adventure books, and I like ways that you can interact with media. But in the hype of everything else that was going on, like in 93 and 94, who knew that Donkey Kong Country is what people really wanted?
Yeah, didn't Donkey Kong Country outsell everything that sold for the Saturn, like the Saturn consoles and games all together that year?
I mean, it's crazy though, right? And this is where Nintendo, you have to give them their flowers in that they stuck to the course of like, no, we're just going to make really great games that rely on the fundamental principles of what people want to play, and the rest of y'all can have your interactive movies and your Corey Haim Double Switch, and all. Like, Nintendo didn't buy into that hype, and they won. Because they stuck to the principles of what made video gaming the institutionalized pastime that it had become. And 3DO just burnt out so quick because those games were so barely games, except for the Horde with Kirk Cameron. I still argue that the fundamental gameplay of the Horde is incredible and the interactive movie is fun.
Oh, I'm going to have to revisit that. That's funny.
Yeah, that should have been a hit. That should have been the 3DO killer app.
Maybe that's the next one that Limited Run Games will get the license to bring it back.
Like, because that was good. There weren't a lot of solid games on the 3DO, but that was one of them.
Yeah, their arcade ports are pretty good. Like, that Street Fighter is pretty good.
Yeah, but I think but the thing is though, is that on one hand you have the Neo Geo for people that wanted the ultra high end arcade at home experience. Like, aside from no blood in the first Mortal Kombat, people didn't really complain too much about the home ports of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter.
Yeah. Because you're not comparing them. You don't have an arcade cabinet next to your Nintendo. Like, it's hard to tell when it's been hours since you've played the arcade port,
Yeah. So I think that even the 3DO had some of that. It just wasn't. And for the price of buying a 3DO, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that in 1994, 1995, you probably could have got maybe not a legit Street Fighter arcade cab, but you probably could have got like one of those clone mod boards.
Yeah, the rainbow.
Yeah, you probably gotten your own Street Fighter cabinet for not much more than a 3DO would have cost you.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. Plus, you still have to buy the 3DO games.
Yeah, of which there weren't all that many. And man, again, and that controller was not the one for yeah.
Well, all right. Well, that's the news. So we have our game club. This time it's a game chosen by Hungry Goria, our previous guest and fantastic content creator. And it is Psychic World for the Master System. So I have terabytes and terabytes I'm a ROM hoarder and an ISO hoarder, even though I own most of the stuff. I did not own this one, and I did not have this in a collection. So I had to go, luckily it was on abandonware.com or .org, whatever that site is. So I had to play it from there, and I put it on the Analog Pocket. And I think it was the EU ROM I had to get. And this game, it's twin sisters who work for this, I don't know, scientist guy. One of the sisters is asleep. There's an explosion, and all the scientist monsters escape and steals one of the sisters. And then the scientist gives you, one of the sisters, powers, ESP powers. And from there, it's a platformer that is really strange. This is the most Master System game I've ever played. And as Hungry Goria points out, the cutscenes are very Ninja Gaiden-esque, which I definitely agreed with. I wish I played this on a bigger screen to see how beautiful it actually looked. It is a very good-looking game, kind of like Zillion or Impossible Mission. And, man, so to use these ESP powers, you have to push down, press 2, and then hold 2, and then use the D-pad to choose your power to use. And it doesn't pause the game in this spot. So when you need these powers, you're usually getting wrecked. And let's see, what else is in my notes here? It's the same developer as Dynamite Duke and Outrun 2019, which I thought was strange. Who is that again? That is Hertz Company. They originally did this for the MSX2 and then ported it to Master System and Game Gear. And yeah, I didn't get very far just because it's been a crazy week for me, and our recording schedule has been pretty crazy. And I could really get into this game if I, had this as a kid when, you only owned like 5 to 10 games. I would recommend this game to anyone with a Master System or a way to play it. And Glenn, I don't know if you remember Psychic World at all.
No, I remember the box cover. I know I've seen this before. I wanted a Master System so bad, like in 88, 89, and I absolutely would have played the hell out of this.
Yeah. It's not a bad game. It feels pretty good to control. It's just one of those games where, like many of those games, you need some time to get used to it and to learn it. I'll definitely give this, it's still in my Analog Pocket, so I'm sure I'll pick it up and play it some more. So in this series of interviews that I'm doing, usually in Game Club we have 2 games, but right now we're doing 1 game per episode. So I would love for you to choose what our listeners will play with and interact with us next.
Let's go with the Horde. Originally,
oh my God.
Originally, I was going to say Leather Goddess of the Phobos. I was like, yeah, we're going to do a text adventure. It's going to be amazing. But no, let's do the Horde. I think people need to rediscover that game and its plotline. Very arcade-like in the gameplay. Little bit of sim action with like farming and things like that, and setting up your city. I think it is one of the most slept-on games of the 90s.
That is great. Well, all right. So next up is usually listener feedback. We do have some feedback, and if our listeners would like to email us, that's email@retrogameclub.net, or you could hit us up on all our socials. We have a link tree in our show notes that Zach takes care of. Thank you, Zach. And Jordan writes in this time about memories of Super Mario Brothers 3, which was a previous Game Club game. And he was a first or second grader, and his dad traveled to Japan for work and brought back a copy of Super Mario Brothers 3 and a Famicom. And when he fired it up for the first time, he just loved finding all the secrets. And it's one of his favorites, and he says it holds up almost as well as Super Mario World. And I just need to say, that is rad. Like, I couldn't imagine having a dad that traveled to Japan and brought home a Famicom with some sweet games. My dad traveled to Toledo. He brought back, I don't know what you bring back from Toledo.
The rest of us had to go see The Wizard in theaters for a preview of Super Mario 3.
Yeah, he could have beaten all those people. He would have known all the secrets first. And going on to our social feedback, our social question of the week, well, just question of the week, was bad games with great music. Glenn, could you think of any bad games with great music? It's kind of a difficult question.
It is, right? Because I think I've tried to purge my brain from like there's nothing worse than when you're playing a game that you absolutely hate or a game that's so difficult that you're ready to destroy the cartridge and just the music again and again and again, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's see. What do our listeners write back with? Starsky writes back with NES Ghostbusters. Yeah, particularly because the Ghostbusters riff is just amazing. And then any Simpsons game, which I think is a great answer. And Gun BR writes in on Discord saying he doesn't know if it's a bad game, but Delta Patrol. The game was so hard, or he's just bad at shmups. But it had an amazing song that was 11 plus minutes long. And luckily, if you pause the game, it keeps playing the music. And so you could finally hear the great song that he says is an adaptation of a Philip Glass song, which is...
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. And he has a second one that is The Human Race by Robert Hubbard on the C64. And if you listen to the song, it was used on so many demos back in the day. I don't know if it's C64 demos or Amiga demos. And then one more, Sword of Sodan on the Amiga. And let's see, No Swear Gamer writes in, maybe controversial, but Phantasy Star 3, even if it's the weakest game of the four, and even though its soundtrack isn't as memorable as others, it is fantastic. And also, a fun fact is the less party members you have, like if one dies, the less instruments are in it. So it's like one instrument per party member, maybe? I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I mean, neither. I think, and I'd imported that game from Japan. I remember playing that, and yeah, the music in that, it's really good. All the Phantasy Star games.
Yeah, that's one. So anyone that listens to this podcast knows I'm not a turn-based player, and over the past, I've been trying to fix that a little bit. So Phantasy Star 1 is the one I started with, so I still have to go through the rest of them.
Oh, Phantasy Star 2 for me, that was one of the first, we're going to stay up all night, spend the entire weekend finishing this.
Luckily now when I play it, there's going to be the quality of life things, on those Genesis collections for Switch and stuff.
Yeah.
Jordan writes in again saying Chrono Cross, he doesn't think it's a bad game, but some people do. And he says the music is absolutely incredible. Blue Williams from the Gamers Week podcast says Sonic 6, which I think is a really good answer. Everyone could agree it's a bad game, but the soundtrack is fun. It's all mid-2000s anime kind of epicness, and it's cheesy, but she loves it. And Retro Game Brews, also from Gamers Week podcast, says, oh, you already talked about this. Bill Lambier Combat Basketball. It's a terrible game, but some of the tracks actually slap, and especially the Division 3 game music. And yeah, so if anyone doesn't listen to the Gamers Week podcast, you should. It's even from episode 1 that they've had it just so polished. It's really good gamer news podcast. And let's see, Gameatroid says Silver Server. If bad means poorly designed and punishingly hard, then it's a bad game, but its soundtrack is totally lit. And then St. John from Nerd Noise Radio writes in saying Spider-Man, X-Men, Arcade's Revenge. And the next question of the episode is actually from a listener from St. John from, again, Nerd Noise Radio. What are your favorite pleasant surprises in video gaming? So what he means by that is a game you didn't think you would like, but you actually ended up loving. Glenn, do you have any of those that you could think of? I know I put you on the spot there.
I know. God, that's kind of tough.
You could probably say the Horde again.
I mean, it had to be a Kirk Cameron. I was like, I'm intrigued as to what's going on here.
Yeah.
But no, I think there's been a lot of games over time that I think I wasn't looking forward to, or I wanted to be contrarian about, and that had something to offer. But I think, I think back to like the Jaws NES game where it was like, I hate this, but I'm going to play it through the end, and it's like, it is kind of weird. There was something great as a kid about having a limited number of games. So when you got a new one, you kind of had to love it at a certain point. I'm talking pre-used games, pre-rentals. It was kind of this is what I'm stuck with, so I better play this from wall to wall. Jaws was one that I was so excited to get, and then I hated it, and I turned a corner on it because I really had no other choice.
That was Temple of Doom for me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that one, a lot of people say it was rough, and I go back and I actually really like it still. But I was forced to like it back in the day. So yours would be Jaws?
Yeah, Jaws.
Nice. Well, if any of our listeners, again, want to email, that's email@retrogameclub.net. And Glenn, people could reach you on X, right? And you also have a website, right?
No, not really. Just X.
Well, all right. Thank you so much for joining us. And everyone should check out Game Boys to Men. It is one of the most important video game podcasts.
Thank you.